You hear the splash before you see it, a muffled sound swallowed by the dark waters of the Bosphorus, where the moonlight doesn't quite reach. The gardeners are walking away now, their faces blank, their hands empty of the sack they carried. Inside that sack, sewn with deliberate slowness just an hour ago, was a woman whose only crime was speaking a name she shouldn't have known. The ripples fade. The palace behind you glows with lantern light, beautiful and silent, and you realize this is not the first time tonight, and it won't be the last. Before we step inside those walls, I have to ask, where in the world are you watching this from? It amazes me every time that a story this dark, from centuries ago, can find its way to your screen, wherever you are. This is the Ottoman Sultan's harem in the early 17th century during the reign of Sultan Murad IV, a ruler who believed mercy was weakness and control required blood. For over 600 years, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, its palaces symbols of art, power, and sophistication. But behind the gilded doors of Topkapi Palace, within the most forbidden quarter of all, existed a system of punishment so calculated, so psychologically devastating, that it makes modern incarceration look almost compassionate. The harem was not a paradise. It was a theater of fear, where beauty was currency and survival meant erasing yourself piece by piece. What you're about to hear comes from palace registers, from the diaries of European ambassadors who glimpsed fragments of the truth, and from the testimonies of women who escaped or were discarded and lived long enough to speak. These are not legends. They are records, preserved in Ottoman archives across Istanbul, written in the careful script of bureaucrats who documented cruelty the way others documented grain shipments. The most powerful figure in the harem wasn't the Sultan. He visited when desire moved him, but he didn't live there. The true sovereign of that hidden world was a man who could never touch a woman, yet held the power to decide who among them would see another sunrise. His title was Kuzlar Asa, the chief black eunuch, and his presence turned blood cold. He was chosen not for wisdom or compassion, but for his capacity to rule through terror without hesitation, to break spirits without breaking a sweat, and to orchestrate suffering with the efficiency of an imperial administrator managing a province. The Kuzlar Asa kept detailed records, not of affection or talent, but of infractions. A woman who laughed too loudly during a banquet, another who looked too long at a palace guard, a third who was reported by her own sister for singing a song from her village, a song that reminded her of a life before the palace. Each notation was a potential death sentence, waiting for the moment when an example needed to be made. The eunuch's power was so absolute that even the Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, negotiated carefully with him. He controlled access, information, and the very atmosphere of the harem. He knew which women were forming friendships, which were whispering about favoritism, and which were beginning to remember they had once been free. But here's what made his reign so suffocating. He didn't rule alone. He built a network of informants among the women themselves, offering tiny privileges and extra candle, a softer pillow, a moment in the garden in exchange for betrayal. Mothers reported daughters. Childhood friends brought to the palace from the same village learned to avoid each other's eyes. Trust became the rarest commodity, more precious than jewels, because it was the one thing that could kill you. The architecture of the harem itself was designed for surveillance. Narrow corridors that amplified whispers. Windows positioned so eunuchs could observe courtyards from hidden alcoves. The gardens, though beautiful, had walls too high to scale and guards who rotated shifts so no woman could predict their movements. The punishments began with what palace documents called corrections, a term so clinical it almost hides the horror. A woman who failed to display sufficient enthusiasm during the Sultan's visit would face the mildest form, standing. It sounds almost absurd until you understand the execution. She would be placed in a central courtyard at dawn, forbidden to sit, lean, or kneel, while the harem went about its day around her. Hours became agony. Her legs swelled. Her back spasmed. But worse than the pain was the humiliation of being a living warning, a statue of disobedience that every other woman had to walk past and internalize. If she collapsed, the punishment escalated. She would be dragged to the isolation cell's room so small you couldn't fully extend your limbs, buried deep in the palace foundations where sound died and time became meaningless. Darkness, absolute and unbroken. Silence, except for the rasp of your own breathing. Food arrived once a day, pushed through a slot too narrow to see the hand that delivered it. Women emerged from these cells changed, their eyes distant, their speech halting. Palace physicians had a term for it, Serai Delili, palace madness. It wasn't treated, it was the desired outcome. But the Ottoman court understood something that cruder empires didn't. The body heals and martyrs inspire. The punishments that destroyed most completely were the ones aimed at the architecture of the soul. One method, documented in the private journals of a Venetian doctor who briefly served the palace, involved the systematic dismantling of memory. A woman suspected of planning escape would be given compounds opium mixed with herbs that dulled the formation of new thoughts while being questioned relentlessly about her past. Where was her village? What did her mother's voice sound like? What was her name before the palace? Over days, sometimes weeks, those memories would blur, then fade, replaced only by the present moment of captivity. When she could no longer remember who she had been, she was released back into the harem, a ghost of herself, incapable of imagining any existence beyond these walls. The question that haunted every woman was this: what was forbidden today? The rules shifted like shadows. A gesture that went unnoticed yesterday could be fatal tomorrow. This deliberate unpredictability was policy, not chaos. It kept everyone off balance, unable to coordinate, unable to trust even their own judgment. A woman named Razieh, mentioned in a 1631 court record, was punished for singing. Not because singing was forbidden, many women sang to entertain the Sultan, but because her song, officials decided afterward, contained a verse that could be interpreted as longing for freedom. She was made to watch as the woman who had taught her the song, an older concubine from Circassia, had her tongue partially severed. Not removed entirely, that would have been too quick. Just damaged enough that speech became a garbled struggle, every word a reminder of what cost a song could carry. For women who committed what the palace considered graver offenses, attempting to send a message outside the walls, forming a romantic attachment with another woman, or worst of all, believing they held genuine influence over the Sultan, the punishments entered a realm that few historians can describe without their voices faltering. There was a ritual, coldly formal, called gerçek eğitimi, reality education. A woman who thought her beauty or cleverness had won the Sultan's heart would be brought to a private chamber and restrained in a chair positioned to give her a perfect view. Then the Sultan would arrive, not to see her, but to be intimate with another concubine, sometimes several, while she was forced to watch every moment. Eunuchs stood beside her, ensuring her eyes stayed open. The psychological fracture this created was immediate and total. Everything she believed about her value, her connection, her future shattered in the space of an hour. But even that wasn't the end. Afterward, officials would read aloud from administrative files, documents she never knew existed, written in the dry language of inventory management. Her name reduced to a code number. Her physical attributes listed with the same clinical detachment used to describe a horse or a bolt of silk. Detailed notes on her performance, her usefulness, her compliance, written by eunuchs who had observed her most private moments and graded them for efficiency. Some women fainted, others retreated into catatonia. A few screamed until their voices gave out. The palace recorded these reactions too, noting which methods produced the most complete submission. The woman in the opening of this story, the one sewn into a sack and drowned, had committed what the palace called sur ihlali, the violation of secrets. She had learned the name of one of the Sultan's illegitimate sons, born to a concubine who had been quietly disposed of years earlier. She hadn't spread the information. She had simply known it, and in the harem's logic, knowledge itself was a form of treason. The sewing ritual was not metaphorical. It was documented procedure, carried out by women specially trained for the task, using needles that caused maximum pain while ensuring the sack remained sealed. The victim was sewn in while fully conscious, the process taking up to an hour, each stitch deliberate, while the other women of the harem were assembled to watch from the courtyard above. The condemned woman's name was Humasha. She was 19. She had been in the palace for 6 years, brought from a village near the Black Sea after Ottoman raiders determined she was beautiful enough for the imperial collection. The records note that she cried, but not that she begged. Begging, by that point, was understood to be useless. The sack was carried through the harem on a route designed for maximum visibility, past the dormitories, past the baths, past the Sultan's private chambers so that her muffled sounds reached every corner. Then the procession moved to the palace walls overlooking the Bosphorus. The drop was not immediate. The sack was held suspended for several minutes, a practice meant to give the victim time to fully understand what was coming and to let the sound of her terror imprint on every witness. When the sack finally hit the water, the women watching from the windows were not allowed to turn away. Eunuchs stood behind them, ensuring every face was angled toward the splash, toward the ripples that spread and faded, toward the place where a human being had just ceased to exist. This was the Empire's final lesson. You are not individuals. You are instruments. And instruments that malfunction are discarded without ceremony. The Venetian doctor who recorded some of these events, a man named Domenico Fabbri, wrote in his journal that the most disturbing aspect was not the cruelty he had seen cruelty in many courts, but the bureaucracy of it. The careful documentation, the standardized procedures, the training programs for executioners, the performance reviews of eunuchs based on their effectiveness at maintaining control. Cruelty, he noted, can be the product of rage or madness. But this was cruelty as administrative policy, as refined as tax collection or military logistics. The Ottoman harem persisted in this form for centuries, evolving in its methods but never in its fundamental logic. Absolute control through absolute fear. It wasn't until the 19th century, under pressure from European powers and internal reform movements, that the most brutal practices were officially discontinued. But the records remain. In the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, in the Topkapı Palace Museum collections, in the private libraries of families whose ancestors served as palace officials, the documents exist punishment logs, medical reports on torture victims, architectural plans showing the isolation cells, even the account books recording payments to executioners. Some of these documents are so disturbing that archivists have restricted access to them, requiring special permission and academic justification to view. A researcher named Dr. Elif Çakır spent 3 years studying the harem punishment records for her doctoral dissertation. She told an interviewer afterward that the hardest part wasn't reading about the physical tortures, but about the psychological ones, the systematic erasure of identity, the forced complicity of victims in oppressing each other, the way the system made survival contingent on betraying everything that made you human. What do you do with knowledge like this? How do you hold it in your mind without being changed by it? These women existed. Their names, or the numbers that replace their names, are still legible in documents written in Ottoman Turkish script, filed away under administrative categories like disciplinary actions and harem management. Humasha, the woman from the Black Sea village, the one who was drowned for knowing a secret she was real. She had a life before the palace, a mother who probably spent years wondering what happened to her daughter, a future that should have included growing old, having children of her own, singing the songs of her village without fear. The empire that did this also built some of the world's most beautiful mosques. It produced poetry, calligraphy, and architectural marvels that still take your breath away. It established legal systems that, in some areas, were more progressive than those in Europe. How do you reconcile that? How does a civilization create transcendent beauty and systematic horror, often within the same palace walls? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, might be that the two aren't contradictions. The same impulse toward order, toward perfection, toward control that produces sublime art can, when applied to human beings, produce something monstrous. The harem's punishment system was, in its own twisted way, a kind of dark craftsmanship refined over generations, constantly improved, treated as a problem of engineering rather than morality. Today, Topkapi Palace is a museum. Tourists walk through the harem quarters, admiring the painted tiles, the delicate fountains, the latticed windows that once prevented escape. The tour guides mention the concubines, usually framing it as a romantic mystery who won the Sultan's heart. Who rose to power? The punishments, if mentioned at all, are softened into vague references to strict rules and harsh discipline. The isolation cells in the basement aren't on the tour. Neither are the account books that list executions alongside furniture repairs. But sometimes, late in the afternoon when the crowds have thinned, if you stand in certain courtyards and let the noise of the city fade, you can almost feel the weight of what happened here. Not as a ghost story, but as a historical fact that refuses to be fully buried. Hundreds of women, over centuries, who died in these rooms or wished they could. Thousands more who survived by fragmenting themselves, by learning to be whatever the moment required, by forgetting or pretending to forget that they had ever been anything other than the empire's property. There's a final detail, found in a marginal note in a palace ledger from 1635. After a particularly brutal series of executions, 12 women drowned in a single month. One of the junior eunuchs broke protocol and wrote a personal comment in the record book. It was discovered by historians only recently, a single line in cramped handwriting that hadn't been part of the official entry. Allah, forgive us, for we have forgotten how. The empire that wrote that line would continue for nearly 3 more centuries. The harem system would persist, its methods evolving but its purpose unchanged, until the empire itself collapsed. And the women, the ones who were sewn into sacks, the ones who stood until their legs gave out, the ones who forgot their own names, they vanished into the dark water, into the unmarked graves, into the careful silence of official history. But the records remain. And as long as they do, so does the truth. That paradise, when built on absolute power, is just another word for hell.